I'd like to welcome you to our walk through the book of Romans. Today we're in Romans, the first chapter, verse number 17. Now, if you didn't listen to yesterday's podcast, go back and listen to that podcast because the Apostle Paul is continuing to teach on the power of the gospel. Verse number 17 says this. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the righteous one will live by faith. Now, first of all, we need to define what this word what it means or what it represents. The word it here represents the gospel. So when we read this, we need to understand it's for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. What does the gospel do? The gospel does many, many different things. But in the gospel, and this is what the Apostle Paul is talking about here, in the gospel, what happens? The righteousness of God is revealed. Why is it important that we preach the gospel? Well, it's important so that people can see the righteousness of God. Now, it says the righteousness of God is revealed. It means that it's uncovered. It means that it's seen. It's one of the ways it actually could be translated is the light was shed upon it. You know, you walk into a completely dark room, you turn the lights on, you see everything that's in that room. Well, that's what the Apostle Paul is talking about, that the gospel comes and it shows us the righteousness of God. Now, what is the righteousness of God? It's God's justice. One of the ways that we can translate this word righteousness is to translate it as the justice of God. How many of you know God is righteous? But yet God brings into our lives justice. Now, if you were to go in front of a judge and if you were guilty of a crime, and that judge sentenced you to whatever the penalty was, people would come and they would say that was justice. And you see, in the gospel, we understand and we see this, that God is absolutely just. He is just. In other words, God saw the sin of man. And God said, I need to be just. And so what did he do? In his sense of righteousness, in his sense of justice, God sent his only begotten Son to pay the penalty for sin. You see, the gospel reveals to us, it reveals to us God's righteousness, but it also reveals to us our unrighteousness. Romans tells us that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. It tells us that we are unrighteous, but it doesn't just leave us there. You know, when you're preaching the gospel to a person, don't just tell them that they're bad and that they're full of sin. You know, one thing that I found out in my life, that most people know that they're sinners. In fact, I believe all people know that they're sinners. But what we need to do is tell them the good news that Jesus died as a substitute for you. He died and took the penalty of sin, and that is the righteousness of God. So what does the gospel do? The gospel shows us God's justice. It shows us God's righteousness, that Jesus came and he took our place on the cross, that he died for our sins. It reveals God's righteousness. But how does it reveal God's righteousness? Now let's go back to verse number 17. The righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Now you say, what in the world does that mean? Well, let me explain it to you. First of all, it's a faith that brings us to God. You see, in order for us to experience salvation, we need to believe that there is a God. The book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse number 6 says, without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is. That's the first step. We need to believe. That's faith. So it's from faith to faith. We believe, first of all, that God is. We believe that he exists. But then it doesn't just leave us there. In the book of Hebrews, again, it says at the end of that verse, and that he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. That's the second type of faith. That type of faith brings God to us. First type of faith brings us to God. It brings us to realizing that there is a God. The second type of faith that's used here, and by the way, it's the same Greek word, but the second area of faith is that it brings God to us. It brings salvation to us. You see, the only way that a person can really experience that the thing that what Jesus did for them is he took their sin upon himself. And the only way that you can really experience this is, first of all, believe that Jesus was God. But second of all, then that faith brings you to this place that you believe in what Jesus did for you on the cross. So it goes from faith to faith. Faith that brings us to God and faith that brings God to us. Do you understand that? And then Paul quotes out of the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk 2, verse number 4, the very end of that verse, it says, for the righteous will live by faith. Paul ends this verse by quoting from Habakkuk, from the prophet Habakkuk. He says, the righteous will live. So we see here this progression. Faith, we believe that God is. Faith, we believe that God is the rewarder of them who diligently seek him. And then we begin not only to believe, but we begin to live a life of faith. Wow. The gospel, it brings all of this into our understanding. I hope you join us again tomorrow as we continue this walk through the book of Romans.